I agree with the chairman this morning when he said Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where Volume 2 of this report puts him.
Welcome back. That was Texas Congressman John Ratcliffe grilling former special counsel Robert Mueller during his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee last Wednesday. And that hearing may have been an audition of sorts for Ratcliffe, a staunch supporter of the president who is now set to be nominated as the new director of national intelligence. The president's announcement confirms weeks of speculation that current National Intelligence Director Dan Coats, who has often clashed with the president, is out of the job. With me now is Ken Dilanian, who covers national security and intelligence for NBC News. So, Ken, Coats out. Trump would like Ratcliffe in, and you have some new reporting on this. What can you tell us?
That's right, Steve. Congressman Ratcliffe has very little national security and intelligence experience, but one thing he has is that he was the U.S. attorney in East Texas about a decade ago. He was a federal prosecutor, and he says on his website that he was a terrorism prosecutor and that he, quote, put terrorists in prison. But NBC News and Pete Williams have been looking closely at the record, and we can find no evidence that Ratcliffe ever prosecuted a terrorism case. We asked his office about that, and they pointed us to a case in Dallas against the Holy Land Foundation, it was a Muslim charity that was convicted of funneling money to a Palestinian terrorism group. But what we learned is that Ratcliffe was appointed as a special prosecutor to investigate juror misconduct in the first trial in that case, which ended in a mistrial. His name appears nowhere in the trial record. So the idea that he convicted terrorists is under question tonight, Steve.
So while we talk about Ratcliffe potentially taking over, there's also the question of Coats himself, the role he's played, and what his absence potentially means in this administration going forward. There have been some high-profile instances. There was one in the summer of 2018, last summer, when the president had that meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki and seemed to question American intelligence on the question of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Coats vouched for the U.S. intelligence, then explained why to Andrea Mitchell a few days later. Listen to what he said.
I said, Mr. President, there will be times when I will have to bring news to you that you don't want to hear. I just want you to know that the news I bring to you, the information I bring to you, will be, to the best extent that we can, be unvarnished, non-politicized, the best that our incredible intelligence agency can produce, so that you will have the information you need to make the policy decisions that you're going to be faced with.
And Ken, that certainly was the reputation of Dan Coats, that he was one of the most, probably the most independent person in Trump's orbit. Is that a fair reputation? Did he earn that?
Absolutely, Steve. That was Dan Coats in a nutshell. Although he was a Republican senator from Indiana, in this job, he adopted a veneer of nonpartisanship, which is really important in the intelligence community. He was willing to speak truth to power. In addition to that clip he played in January at the Worldwide Threat hearing, he said a number of things that were at odds with what President Trump has been saying, particularly that the U.S. intelligence community assesses that North Korea is unlikely to give up its nuclear weapons. And so that did not earn Dan Coats any goodwill from President Trump, but it did earn him a lot of praise from within the intelligence community. And the fear now is that in Ratcliffe, you have a person who is going to tell Trump what he wants to hear. And we're basing that only on his performance in these public hearings. He, of course, may put aside that partisanship, and I'm sure he'll be grilled about this in the confirmation hearings. But right now, there are a lot of questions about whether Ratcliffe can play the same role that Coats played.
Okay,
Steve.
Ken Dilanian, and obviously, yes, we will keep an eye on that confirmation process as it goes forward. Ken, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks.
I'll be right back.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.